here. As Chris kindly introduced, I'm Melissa. I'm one of our policy chairs of NYSEIA, which is the New York State Solar Trade Association. I'm also Director of Government and Utility Affairs for Renova Solar. And so today's session is really about interconnection. I'm sure all of you in this room have heard that word, some of you ad nauseum, some of you just like on the periphery. It's been a huge issue in New York that's really come to a head in the last 12 to 18 months, and I really want to walk you through what's going on with that, where it's headed. Today is a very apropos day for this talk to be given. Yesterday, the Public Service Commission had on their meeting agenda the new standard interconnection requirements for New York. And it was on the consent agenda, which is just their fancy way of saying they agreed and no one talked about it. So we didn't get to see the order until about 45 minutes ago. But it very much still lines up with the presentation, and it's really exciting to have the latest information to share with you. My style would be, if you have questions throughout, please just jump in or raise your hand. I don't see any reason to hold them to the end if that's okay with the organizers. So really basics, just for folks who aren't coming from a developer background. Obviously the SIR is what we call it for short. It's the standard interconnection requirements in New York. And they're all about having standardized best practices for how you apply to connect a solar PV or other distributed generation system to the distribution grid, right? So we're not talking transmission grid here, we're talking distribution grid. Those are the wires that run down your roads, single phase, three phase, that are serving the load typically. This is a document that's been in New York since 1999. It's had a couple upgrades, but this one that just happened today is probably the most significant in quite a long time. And the reason that we're talking about it here today, this summit is obviously about community shared solar, CDG, how it's getting off the ground, and how to make all the nuts and bolts work, how to finance it, we haven't talked about permitting, but how to permit it and zone it, how to manage it. And this is really a key part of the development process, is actually getting these things to be sited at places where they can connect successfully, cost-effectively to the electric distribution grid. And location is a key to that. As I go through the details in the next couple slides, you're going to see there's going to be more tools at your fingertips going forward, starting in April, than there ever has been before, to know ahead of time what you're getting into with a particular property, and to be able to plan accordingly, as opposed to throwing things against the wall and hoping something sticks, and clogging up the interconnection queue at the same time. So what I'm going to focus on here is the SIR and other related changes. That's the core of this. Obviously, we're aimed at streamlining this, but we really feel strongly about maintaining the safety and reliability of the system. And I know Mike will talk about that. This obviously is a priority for the industry, it's a priority for the utilities. And we really see this as improving communication and cooperation between the two. We've been sitting at a lot of joint tables working together on all of these improvements. They've been a great leader, as is NYSERDA, as is DPS, and the Public Service Commission. And then also for folks here who are from local government, I think it's a really interesting way for you how does this connect to you? Of course, if you want to do a project, but the one thing or two things that I see is implications for zoning. We get a lot of questions about, if I'm doing new zoning for my jurisdiction, what do I think about what is important for being able to enable these projects in a responsible way? And also, we have a lot of municipalities who are beginning to be like, whoa, what if I get overwhelmed? Do I need a moratorium or something? We've heard that ugly word mentioned a couple times in Central New York recently, and I think actually understanding a little bit more about interconnection can very much allay those concerns, because fundamentally the pace of projects is limited by the distribution grid, and having a good process to enable that is going to make that all the more clear to folks like municipalities. So recent challenges. So if we rewind 1 year, we were here a year ago. These are some of the things that were going on, and I know many of you in the room know this as well or better than I do. We had a lot of problems just with delays in preliminary reports and studies, and a lot of that it was not anyone's fault. It was changes in regulation. So there were big changes when we went from monetary to volumetric remote net metering. There was a big bump when community shared solar went live in October, particularly downstate. So there have been regulatory bubbles or waves that have exacerbated that situation. We had different technical standards being used by utilities across the state. And in our SIR, we didn't actually have any standard technical requirements or standards that everyone had to use. And these are the standards that are used to evaluate project feasibility, whether you get back a no or a yes, but also what it costs. There wasn't a lot of transparency in some jurisdictions about upgrades. So if you did, and we'll go through what the process actually is for folks who haven't been in the weeds on this, but if you went through a process and you got to the end result and you just saw $1 million price tag, sometimes people could not tell what that was truly based upon. So that plus the fact that there wasn't much kind of planning or rules for costs or contingencies on costs, those are things we heard a lot about last year. There were limited formal processes in place for interconnection queue management. And I know Mike was mentioning this as we were kind of coming up here, is that something I'll talk about in a minute about what's going to happen with the management of the interconnection queue, which matters to developers because you may be sitting behind several of their projects and you don't know if they're real or they're not real, they're taking up space, how do they get cleaned out? It's a big topic for New York today and going forward. And all of these things, these challenges that we were experiencing, obviously slow down development, they slow down the projects that we really want to see put online, they increase cost, they discourage companies from entering the state or being able to actually do the business they want to do. And so that's why all of these came to our attention. So in the last year, we've done a lot on this, and I'm speaking on behalf of NYSEIA, and many other stakeholders in the industry have contributed tremendously. All of this kind of started last February when Department of Public Service said, yes, we want to do a revision to this document, to these rules, that they're not working as well as we need them to. Cornell was kind enough to host a conference last July with NYSEIA. We had about 50 developers from around the state there, and we actually hammered through what are the problems, where are they coming from, and actually proposed solutions and drafted a large letter to the Public Service Commission, the DPS staff, governor's office, with proposed solutions. With about 50 different organizations signed on. So after all of this work, where are we at? So as I said yesterday, which I'm about to go into the details, the PSC put out a new update to the standard interconnection requirements, which is going to make a lot of things a huge step forward. We also had a launch of 2 important state-level resources or processes, depending on how you want to refer to them. One is called the Interconnection Technical Working Group, which is a state-level body that's part industry, part utility, part government, that's going to be working on every other issue that did not get into this update in a proactive way. So meeting, and I'll go into more detail, meeting every 2 months for 6 or 8 hours, and actually hammering through these issues, and doing so in a transparent way. So that if you, as a company, as a nonprofit, as a municipality, want to see what's going on, you can look at the online agenda, you can listen to the meetings, you can see the notes, you can see the recommendations or decisions. And I guess last but not least, I don't want to forget the interconnection ombudsmen. But the folks, they're actually, so one thing I'll talk about briefly is we don't have a formal dispute resolution process that actually gets used right now for interconnection. If you have a problem, there is a process in the current rules, but it takes a really long time and no one ever uses it. So as a short-term kind of step towards the future, they put in place some interconnection ombudsman people that will solve problems for you. And I'll talk more about that. So, the heart of the matter. So the actual SIR update. So this is for anyone who loves to go to the PSC page and pull up case numbers and dockets. That's the case number. You can read the full order as we were just scanning through before we came in here. This I drafted before today, so it says proposed, but I'll comment on whether we actually, that's what it is or something different as I go through it. So, big changes from a developing community shared solar project perspective. One is, as I mentioned earlier or alluded to, is the introduction of something called a pre-application report. So today, or yesterday, if you want to know something about a circuit, right, you drive by, you look at it, you can tell if it's 3-phase or single-phase. Maybe you can go to a substation and tell a little bit more about the line. You can call someone. You probably put in an application to learn which actions you know about the circuit, which means you go into the queue. And there may or may not be a site. You may or may not actually have a customer that's going to move forward on that. Those days are over. So delete that from your brains. We're not doing that anymore. What we have now is effective. It will be effective at the end of April, all of these changes. I think it's April 27th? 29th, thank you. In the order. We're going to have a pre-application report. So instead of, you don't have to have a customer name, and you don't have to get in the queue. You can simply request a report, and there's about 10 to 15, I'm forgetting the exact number, technical parameters that will come back to you. And there was a good discussion about whether it should be, just a kind of a checkbox, a qualitative versus quantitative, it's going to be quantitative, that's in the order. So it's going to tell you exactly what the minimum load, if it's available, the peak load, the substation details, the fault current, you name it. They were really, really great about putting all the key things that not everyone in your teams will know what the heck they mean, but if you have a resource or you can share resources with others to be able to just go through that, in about 15, 20 minutes you can have a really good sense of probably what could go on that circuit. Doesn't mean you still don't have to go through the actual process, but you're not blind anymore. You really have some good information to base your decisions on. The details on that, I think I do detail later, but the details on that are, it's going to be a 10-day turnaround.
Wow.
And it is $750. So the price for it did go up a little bit. That was the only thing we weren't able to adjust anymore, but that $750 is able to be applied towards your application fee. So if you do a preliminary, pre-application report, you decide to do an application, there's no charge for that. The second thing that is equally important, in some cases if not more, is a set of standard technical screens being in the standard interconnection requirements document. So as I mentioned, utilities had used different screens. A lot of them very good and thoughtful, but just very different across the state, different, from different sources, different interpretations. That is also something that is of the past. So there's a standard set of initial screens that will be used to review projects. And the really key part here is if you pass those screens, the language is explicit in the new document that came out that you move directly to go. So you move to a contract, no study, no upgrades, which I really think will really help take some of the burden off of just having to do studies for things that are really not going to have an impact on the system. So we're really excited to see that, and I think implemented right, it will be really positive for both the industry and for the utilities. Try to clear out a lot of the noise. One thing I didn't mention here that also is actually in the order that we didn't expect is they also put in place supplemental screens. It had been a recommendation of ours, but not something that we had thought was going to be in this round. What that is, in really short, is a second round of screens. If you fail one of the first 5 or 6, there actually is a second round of screens that your project will be evaluated by in a very quick fashion, so 10 business days or something. So if you pass those, it can be solved. You don't have to go to a full study. So the idea here is to offer an expedited pathway for systems that are not an issue, and to allow them to, with confidence and without a lot of subjectivity, to go straight to an actual contract and not be bogged down. And if people are curious about the actual screens, happy to talk about them in more detail. The third bullet point here, elimination of blanket upgrade requirements. That's kind of part and parcel of the one above it. Some utilities just in different parts of the state had kind of just a blanket requirement. If you hit 250 kW AC, you trigger this. And so that also, just by the implication of these rules, is not going to be standard practice going forward. Like, you have to have a technical reason to require something. And if you pass the screens, you can't have a blanket requirement for an upgrade. You have to actually fail a screen and not be solved by the supplemental screens to get into that kind of territory. Other improvements, after you complete, so a CSER, for anyone who doesn't know, is just the study. So there's, on the next page I'll talk about the different steps of the process really quickly. CSER is actually the full study that you have to go into for larger projects. The payment on that, after a study is completed, has always been to date, you pay for all the improvements up front. So if I do a study with the utility and it comes back at $100,000, and I say, great, no problem. If I want to actually execute that contract, which sometimes I need for financing, I definitely need it to lock in the property tax status of my project, which could be a whole other conversation. But you often want to lock that in. You have to pay the full $100,000 at that point before you want to do any kind of construction. So they've changed that. It's now going to be 25%. So you can pay 25% of the actual upgrade costs to confirm that contract and lock in your status there. And then you just have to pay the remainder before the start of construction of the utility upgrades, which I think is really, really helpful. Last thing here on cost is about contingencies and details. So there is requirements in the new document for when a utility comes back with a CSER for you. They will be detailing more line item like style of what the actual upgrades are and the cost per line item. I believe we'll have to look at the exact language, but that's what had been proposed, and it's something similar. They also are going to put a limitation on the contingency. So, I mean, a lot of utilities have been great about this, but occasionally there definitely been situations where costs come back and they have a contingency on this piece and an overall contingency, and you add it up and it's like 100% contingency. So it could be $1 million or $2 million, I don't really know. And that was challenging. So they limited the contingency. The number in the final document today, I believe, is 25%. So it's going to be a 25% overall contingency. And then we did propose additional timelines with queue management implications, which we were chatting about earlier. I think the joint utilities and the industry really want to see queue management be a priority. Like, we don't have a good process. We don't really have a process in New York right now that's formalized in a very big way for managing the queue. And as people sit behind other people and projects linger, we definitely want to see that happen. And we had proposed the beginnings of that, I think, as at the joint utilities, and that didn't get in here. My instinct is it's going to be something that's going to be taken up by the technical working group, which I'm just going to talk about in a second. So real quickly, the new process from a practical nuts and bolts level, since that's what this is supposed to be. The new process going forward, we can kind of cross out expected now. We are going to have the pre-application report, which is optional. There's your 750 and your 10 business days. You have your initial review, which is the new word for the preliminary reports that we used to get back. The same kind of deal. If you did this, you can use the 750 towards this. If you do it within, right now it's within 15 business days. If you pass that, then you go directly to a contract with no study or upgrade required. If you fail this, there will be this supplemental process, which, as I mentioned, we didn't expect to see, which is great. So there'll be a supplemental review process in here in the middle. If you fail both of those and aren't able to kind of have a quick resolution to it, then you go to a full study. And that has a cost range that still varies quite a bit across the state, but it ranges, as far as I've seen, from like $5,000 to $20,000 per study. Excuse me. And the 60-day business timeline of that is the same as it has been, which is about, thank you. After the completion of the study, that's when you would pay the 25% of the proposed upgrade costs if you wish to move forward, and that locks in your interconnection contract, your place in that, in the queue on that line, and also your property tax status per the current property tax law in New York if you're in a jurisdiction that is not opted out. And then, of course, you pay the remaining part just before you actually want the utility to go ahead and construct the improvements. So what about everything else, right? I know there's a lot of people in the room that have had other issues that are things that we didn't get to address in this first round, and we definitely are super, super cognizant of that. So here are other remaining priority things. They're not in the current SIR with the exception of A. So the supplemental agreements did get in there unexpectedly. Everything else are things that were not able to be put into the current update, but are really important topics that both the industry and the joint utilities are actively collaborating on and working towards solutions that works for everybody, that lets solar interconnect to the grid much more easily, efficiently, but really maintains the safety and reliability of the system, and as we work with REV to innovate the business models so that everybody can benefit from these kind of projects going online. So some of the things that aren't in there currently that will be being worked on, the customer name requirement. So that's the new requirement that you have to have a customer name. Obviously for CDG, for community shared solar, you guys are, those projects are exempt from that requirement.
That was the question.
Yeah. But just in general, with that exception, everyone else saw that you guys got that and really wanted to see that for all projects across the state. In the sense that, of course, utilities have to know the name at some point, but whether we could evolve towards something where you could do land development and interconnection processing without having a customer for sure lined up or paired up with that site. There's enforcement mechanisms. This is a big one. Enforcement mechanisms and incentives for timelines being met. And that's definitely something that's coming up through REV Track 2. There was a conference it was 2 months ago now, about actually, through REV, putting something called an earnings mechanism, impact impact mechanism. Someone here should know the word.
Yes,
Thank you.
You got it.
Which actually would mean that you get paid the utility would get paid if it does better than the proposed timeline. If it just meets the timeline, it's a neutral thing. If it goes beyond the timeline, it gets penalized economically. That's kind of the Commission's approach to a lot of turning things into a financial impact. So I know a lot of folks, a lot of developers I've worked with, one of the big problems is it's great to have timelines in the SIR, but if the timelines don't get met, again, through a bubble of regulatory issues or other things, what do you do? They don't necessarily mean a lot. So I think that this will be something that we're going to be very involved in through REV to see where that goes and if that can really help solve that problem. And so, process for updating the initial reviews in the CSER, so it's still missing from the SIR. If you have a study done and you decide to change the size of the project or pull a project off of it, it's a study of 2 projects, there's no rules for that currently, and there needs to be. It's a real simple thing. I think it just got to get lost in the noise, but it's something we really want to see done, so there are set procedures for updating studies in particular. Again, queue management process is huge, really, really important, I think, for everyone. And having some kind of queue transparency. So the current SIR requires more frequent updating from the utilities to the state about the queue, but still, like, as far as I understand, we won't be able to see it, and it's still, there's not much of a formal management process. Obviously, the utilities do, I think, a really solid, good job of managing internally, but from us, like, we can't tell who's on what circuit, we can't tell much of anything. So I know that that's something that's going to be a priority for the state and for the technical working group. Cost sharing options. Another thing is you get to a certain percent of peak load on a line or on a substation, and it's going to be $1 million to upgrade this. Everyone is in agreement that wouldn't it be great to know how you could share that across a couple customers, a couple projects that aren't always all you. There's also talk about, in the REV DSIP process, about rate basing. Certain lines need to be upgraded, and it's a benefit across the state for the public. They're exploring concepts like California has done, whether certain things should be upgraded and actually put into the rate base. And last but not least, and this is actually what the technical working group is named for this one, what it's really going to focus on, besides all those things, are some technical issues that just need to be kind of worked through cooperatively with the utilities and with the state. So if people are running into different interpretations across the state about things like substation reverse power flow, when a substation needs to be upgraded, how it's upgraded, what the cost is, when does a system need to be monitored not with production monitoring, but monitored from the utilities point of view, when do you have to have control? This is like SCADA and RTUs. When does that stuff actually should be triggered? Direct transfer trip, same bucket. As well as other anti-islanding things and requests. So all of that is going to be the core part of what the technical working group is about. And they're going to be working through these topics systematically and hopefully coming to consensus and being able to put in place what we're calling best practices. So New York's aiming for an SIR that will be updated again soon with some additional fixes, plus a best practice document, which will have things that are too technical and wonky to go in the SIR, but that the utilities and the industry have been able to come to an understanding on, this is the best way to do this, and it can be much more standardized than it is today across the state. Yeah.
So this is a particular thorn in my foot, since I was the one that sat on the first PSC standard interconnection hearings of this for years.
Sure.
And the C is a big issue, obviously, but I'm wondering what, since there are 2 agencies involved, the PSC and the ISO has this fun thing called a accelerated interconnection process, which is a joke. Do you think there is coordination now possible between the governments?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I think at this point there hasn't been. So right now it's like everything distribution oriented. If you're connecting to the distribution grid, which is probably going to be 99% of your projects, is all through the SIR, which is now allowed to take projects up to 5 megawatts, but net metering is at 2. So really up to 2 is what we see in the near term. With the ISO, when you get into FERC and transmission lines, I think we're going to see a lot more discussion about that with the Clean Energy Standard, which is actively being worked on right now. So if that happens successfully and we have utility scale solar opportunities, we're going to want to put a lot of those on the transmission grid and then decide whether do they ever go through the SIR at all, or do they just go through a different, NYSEIA FERC process? And I don't think there's an answer to that yet. Yeah.
These are obviously very exciting developments. Where do you see the line of demarcation between looking forward and
Sure.
projects that are already in the queue?
Sure.
Will these changes impact projects that have already submitted applications?
That's a really good question. I don't think I know the answer to that. Do you know the answer? He just wondered if projects are already in the queue, was your impression that any of this would apply?
I've been hearing some dates filtering around, but don't quote me. That some were looking at taking projects that were, applications were submitted October 1 of 2015 and putting them through the new SIR. But again, that's not official,
So I think it's a good, thank you, that Mike, that's really helpful. I think it's a good question we should ask, and I'd be happy to get an answer for you.
So if 2 megawatts is the most that's allowed for an individual project, is it hypothetical, you could say, to ask for 4 megawatts, would they entertain that, or if you only ask for an evaluation of 2 megawatts on a particular site?
Yeah, so this is the interconnection rules, and then there's net metering, which is kind of the
Right.
sister cousin that sits next to it. Net metering is what's capped at the 2 megawatts, and the commission has been very clear that they plan to stay at that cap at least through 2016 as far
Right,
as.
but I'm saying, say you have a site that could be subdivided into 2 megawatt projects, and you want to do an
Correct.
interconnection to one line, can you do an interconnection application saying, can this line handle 4 megawatts, or is it, how is that looked at?
No, that is a good question. I mean, my impression would be you'd have to do them separately at this
You
point.
would have to, yeah, if you remember, there was an order back in April last year that if you're submitting for two megawatt projects, you have to split both parcels up, and they have to be separate services for each parcel.
Prior to the evaluation of the, prior to, okay.
I mean, I think in reality, and Mike can speak better to this being in with the utility, but I mean, my guess is that you have to put in 2 separate applications.
Yes.
They would probably group them together for one study.
Yes, you would, yeah,
So-
that's not like talk as group studies,
Group
especially if
studies,
you're the
okay.
same developer.
Right, so if it's you with 2 or 3 projects side by side on a road, probably they would have some efficiencies in grouping them, but the actual application process.
2
for
separate
the-
applications.
Unfortunately, I think that would still be the way it would be done.
And the other thing, the question with the net metering, they has to be legislated through public service law on the net metering increase, if they allow a net metering increase above 2 megawatts.
Right, and what they've done in the last 6 months is they put the caps, kind of a floating cap, so right now the caps on how much capacity can go into utility territory, they don't apply really for the next year or so as we figure out what's next. And so I think because of that and trying to be fair to all parties, they're basically going to wait on any 2 megawatt net metering increase until some of these other issues are resolved. So, and you guys are going to.
Some of the things listed under G are things that the utilities perhaps ought to be doing anyway to upgrade the grid. Has any thought been given to that and how those things might fit together?
I mean, it's definitely a topic in REV. Is that, I mean, obviously we do need grid, resiliency and reliability upgrades anyway, and that's something, it's not being covered exactly here. Some of these are very much about the solar. It's not really that, I mean, other folks can speak better to this, but what the weaknesses in the grid or the aging infrastructure may not exactly be these kind of issues. This is more about pushing power in the opposite direction. So we're actually pushing power a different way than this entire system was designed.
Unless I can answer that question. Well, we'll take a look at every year, actually, we take a look, forecast of maybe 3-year, what we call a reliability plan. And what we look at is feeders or substation, primarily feeders, that see a lot of reliability issues due to, animals, trees, and so forth. What we do, we take a look at those feeders that, what we call is the worst performing reliability-wise. And that's how we schedule our capital work plan to upgrade those feeders so they make them more reliable. So that's the only thing right now that utility does on a capital upgrade.
Right, so right now it doesn't necessarily dovetail with these things, but it definitely is, I know it's being discussed in the Rev Track 2 and the GSIP process. That's a great question. Yeah.
So in the pre-app or the initial review, will there be feedback on like the step function of size that avoids costs? Like if you sometimes the feeder characteristics, if you apply 2 megawatts, but if you scale it back to 1.75, you avoid a $100,000 charge. Is that kind of collaboration between what is feasible and what is not, or is that kind of when the online maps come?
Sure, no, that's a great question. So the question just was like, when you get the pre-application report back, like it will have all these technical details. Will it tell you, you asked for a 2 megawatt AC connection, it's going to cost you this. If you drop down to 1.5 megawatts, you'd save this amount. And the answer is no. Because that's getting into, like, they're not going to give you a cost in that pre-application report. That pre-application report is really just giving you the key information for you to say, when you do a lot of these projects, you get a pretty good sense of what can go where, and if you've done one before, you have a sense of what the ballpark costs might be. So it's relying more on industry experience and kind of aptitude or ability to analyze this information.
And one thing just to note on the pre-app report, that information that's given to the developer is good as that day. It's always, it's subject to change because we could have got another 6 more applications, formalized applications after on that specific feeder. So that pre-app report that was given to you is only good to that day it was generated. and given.
What about the initial review though? Because if you don't want to pay for a $20,000 CSER study if you know that scaling the project back by 200 kilowatts is going to avoid, and you're going to go through the kind of straight contract pass. Is there, maybe not the pre-app or the initial review, or are they giving more collaborative feedback on your size relative to the feeder's capacity?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, at this point, no. At this point, the cost has not really gotten until you get to the full study. What happens is that developers do a few of these and then they kind of know where this is headed. That being said, if it's one of your first projects or if it's in a new territory and you don't know, then you're absolutely right that you're kind of have this hole in your information that would help you make the best decision. So something we should love to talk afterwards. I mean, as I said, this is an ongoing process, so if there's a suggestion for what could be an initial review that would be really helpful without making them do a full study first to get to that answer, I think people are very open to, what do you need to make things work successfully? That's what we're all about here trying to do. So, but at this point, it's been more, we have a little experience. Once we look at this technical information, we kind of know about size, and we know if we do a 2 megawatt project in this kind of area, ballpark, probably what it's going to cost, et cetera, et cetera. So it relies more on the experience of the developer.
I think with that, we're going to actually cut off questions for now, so we
Sorry,
can
Chris.
give Mike a chance to do this presentation.
I
But
think there's just one more slide.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. So just in terms of these issues that I was too long going through, and I apologize for that. The solutions, as I mentioned, the state level New York interconnection technical working group is huge. And whether as that gentleman was pointing out, whether it's hey, could this include this, it would be really helpful, or hey, I'm having this technical problem. I mean, anything that you want, this is the perfect place to funnel it. And if it doesn't belong there for some reason, we will find another way to get it addressed in an appropriate, side-by-side venue. But it's going to be, we have 4 solar industry reps. We've got the 5 joint utilities. We've got DPS and NYSERDA involved. We may end up with a national lab or some other large nonprofit involved as well. Open meetings, visibility, as I said, on topics, discussion, decisions, recommendations. You can, I think, probably will be able to call in or be in person. And really, we're generating here an additional update, improvement to the SIR going forward, hopefully this year if it's needed, as well as best practice standards document that will sit side by side. And then the REV stuff is where the earnings impact mechanisms and the kind of actually enforce, being able to put something behind the timelines and actually let the utility build capacity. They're not being paid for this stuff right now. So how do we get them revenue so that they can afford to do the staffing they want to do and other improvements to increase the efficiency of the processing. And then the ombudsman persons that I mentioned, who are also mentioned in the press release about yesterday's order that came out, or yesterday's decision, which was released today as an order. And so if you are having problems with large projects in particular, and they're far along in the process and they're totally stuck, these people are begging for you to reach out to them so they can help. If you have smaller projects or smaller problems or they're newer, they may not be able to get to you right away, but we'd be happy at NYSEIA to be in the middle and try to facilitate that. And this will hopefully evolve towards a more formal dispute resolution process. And I think I'm out of time, but these are just basically some best practices about what you can do to make sure that interconnection goes well, because I know this is supposed to be nuts and bolts. So as we said earlier, site selection and early due diligence is essential. Besides the land itself, interconnection, you want to know this, you want that pre-application report, you want to have a partnership or in-house resources to analyze it, is a huge, 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 advantage to you to be able to do that. And then, also having just a good working relationship with the utilities. I mean, we all share the same goals, we really do. We want to interconnect solar, we want to maintain the safety and reliability of the system, and building those relationships is really key, and I think we're making a lot of progress in the last 8 months. And then there are some unique things to community solar, and I don't have time to talk about them now, but as you get into these, please, let us know. These are two that are on our radar now, but there are some different documents involved, some different agreements, and there's this creditworthiness question that needs to be fleshed out in more detail. Happy to answer questions about that later, but I'm happy to also expand this list and work on problems if they're arising. Thank you very much.